What if I told you that everything you believed about the glamorous life of aristocratic mansions was just a beautiful facade? Behind the majestic facades of Victorian estates lay an invisible mechanism powered by human fuel. It was a world of shadows where thousands of people existed in a parallel reality, serving the whims of the elite. Their lives were subject to a brutal routine that left no room for personal freedom or spontaneity. They woke up before dawn and went to bed when their masters were already dreaming their third dreams. Their names were often forgotten, and their personalities were erased in favor of the function they performed. It was a complex system where a mistake could cost a person their roof over their head and their daily bread. Watch the video to the end to find out how one small mistake while setting the table could ruin a person's life forever. What if I showed you how the walls of a house could be a tool of social oppression? Victorian architects designed house plans with maniacal precision to separate two worlds. A mansion was not just a dwelling, but a complex labyrinth with a double bottom. There was the formal part, filled with light, mirrors, and soft carpets. And there was the hidden part, dark and functional, where the lives of those who provided that light took place. The boundary between these worlds was a door covered with green cloth. It was designed to muffle any sounds coming from the service quarters. The smells of the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, and the voices of the servants died away before reaching the master's quarters. This door was a symbolic barrier that was strictly forbidden to cross without permission. Behind this door began narrow, steep staircases without railings or decoration. The walls here were often unplastered or painted in dark, practical colors that did not show dirt. The floors were bare of carpets to make them easier to wash, and footsteps echoed hollowly. These were ghostly routes that had to be traversed quickly and silently. The layout of the corridors was confusing and not obvious to the untrained eye. Service passages were hidden within the thickness of the walls, bypassing the formal halls and bedrooms. A servant could reach any room without appearing in the main galleries of the house. They glided inside the skeleton of the building, providing comfort but remaining invisible. The living quarters for the staff were usually located at the very top, under the roof, or in the semi-basements. In summer, the attic rooms were heated by the sun, turning into stuffy chambers. In winter, there were drafts, and the water in the wash basins was covered with a crust of ice by morning. As a rule, there was no heating in the servants' rooms. The windows in these rooms were often located too high near the ceiling. This was done on purpose so that the servants could not look out onto the street or the courtyard. Their gaze had to be directed inward, toward their work, and not toward the outside world. Even the architecture dictated that their place was in the shadows. Male and female staff lived in strictly separate wings of the house. The door between these areas was often locked with a key kept by the housekeeper or butler. Any attempt to enter the other side was punished by immediate dismissal without discussion. Morality was observed no less strictly than the cleanliness of silverware. Encountering the master in the hallway was considered an unacceptable breach of protocol. If this happened, the servant was obliged to immediately turn to face the wall and freeze. He had to literally blend in with the wallpaper, becoming an inanimate object of the interior. Direct eye contact was considered insolence and a violation of the chain of command. This whole complex system had one main goal: to create the illusion that the house ran itself. Fireplaces were lit, clothes were cleaned, and food appeared on the table as if by magic. The master was not supposed to see the sweat, effort, and dirt that accompanied this process. Comfort was only valued when it seemed natural and effortless. I wonder how this theme is perceived in different parts of the world, where the architecture of houses was different. Where are you from? Do you agree that the layout of a building can have such a strong influence on people's psychology? Write about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about who really had the keys to all the doors in the huge estate? Formally and legally, the house and land belonged to the lord whose ancestors built these walls. But the actual absolute ruler of its lower, serviceable part was the butler, not the aristocrat. He was a monumental figure who inspired sacred awe and respect in all the inhabitants of the service quarters, without exception. His power over the staff was absolute and despotic, and his word was never to be questioned or challenged. For the footmen and maids, he was a king and judge, whose mood determined their careers and peace of mind. The master might not know the names of his servants, but the butler knew everything about them. He ruled the complex mechanism of the house with an iron fist hidden in a white glove. Any breach of subordination was punished instantly, up to and including dismissal without recommendation. His working day began long before the masters woke up, with a ritual tour of all the estates and a personal security check of the perimeter. He personally, trusting no one else with this task, unlocked the heavy bolts on the entrance doors and checked the reliability of the locks on the first-floor windows. The house had to be a fortress at night and a hospitable palace during the day, and he was the one who controlled this transition. One of his specific morning duties was to carefully prepare the fresh newspaper for his master's breakfast. He neatly ironed each page of the fresh issue with a hot iron to finally set the wet printing ink. This was not done for disinfection purposes, but to prevent the gentleman from staining his hands or snow-white gloves while reading the news. Such a seemingly minor detail speaks volumes about the incredible, almost maniacal level of perfectionism in everyday life at that time. The comfort of the masters was paramount, and even ink on paper was not allowed to disturb them. The butler created an ideal world in which there was no place for everyday inconveniences. It was the magic of service, hidden from prying eyes. The cool wine cellar was the butler's sacred and inviolable territory, where no other servant had access under penalty of punishment. He kept strict records of every bottle, meticulously recording receipts and expenditures in a special ledger. This was necessary because wine was one of the largest items of expenditure in the household budget. A deep knowledge of wines, the ability to decant them correctly, separating the sediment, and serving them at the right temperature was an essential part of his profession. He himself decided which wine to serve with dinner, unless the master gave specific instructions. The heavy key to the cellar always hung on a chain around his neck or lay in his waistcoat pocket as a visible symbol of his high status. The evening's formal dinner service was his moment to shine, and the main stage where he demonstrated his skills. He always stood directly behind the host's chair, impassive, upright, and attentive, like a living statue. The butler did not personally carry the plates. He directed the actions of the footmen, managing them like a conductor directing an orchestra. He did not need to shout. A stern glance or a barely noticeable movement of his eyebrow was enough for the footman to understand his orders. He kept a watchful eye to ensure that the guests' glasses were never empty and that the dishes were changed on time and silently. But he did this so unobtrusively that his presence became almost invisible, dissolving into the atmosphere of the evening. However, the most interesting and hidden part of his power was manifested downstairs in the servants' hall, where the staff dined. At dinner, he always sat at the head of the long table, precisely copying the manners and habits of his master upstairs. No one dared to sit down at the table until he did, and no one began to eat without his permission. His salary was the highest in the entire staff, which allowed him to accumulate substantial savings over the years. Since housing and food were provided by the state, many butlers dreamed of saving enough money to open their own pub or small hotel in retirement. It was their cherished dream to finally become masters of their own lives and businesses. For this goal, they endured the whims of their masters and decades of living in other people's homes. It was a prospect that gave them the strength to maintain their dignity and professionalism every day. But until they retired, they had to serve faithfully, forgetting their personal ambitions. The price for such high status and salary was total, piercing loneliness inside a large and crowded house. The butler could not afford to be friends with the footmen or maids, lest he lose his unquestionable authority and distance. Familiarity could destroy the discipline on which the whole house depended. He was isolated at the very top of his small pyramid of power, with no right to weakness or candor. The only person more or less equal to him in status with whom he could talk was the housekeeper. They were like a father and mother to the rest of the staff, sharing the burden of responsibility. He knew absolutely all the family's secrets, heard all the private conversations at the table, and saw all the human weaknesses of his masters. He knew about the debts, betrayals, and family scandals that were carefully hidden from society, but his face always remained an impenetrable mask, expressing no emotion or judgment. Silence was his main commodity, which he sold along with his labor and his main professional virtue. A talkative butler could not last a week in service. In the next chapter, you will learn about the woman who was even closer to the most intimate secrets of the mistress of the house. What if I told you that the most influential woman in the house did not bear the owner's surname? We are talking about the chambermaid, the lady's personal maid, who occupied a special place in the hierarchy. She was exempt from heavy black housework, such as washing floors. Her tools were a needle, scissors, a comb, and endless patience. Her morning began long before the mistress woke up, with the preparation of tea and clothes. She had to anticipate the lady's mood and choose an outfit appropriate for the day's plans. Every detail of the outfit was checked for the slightest defect. A torn button or a stain could be grounds for a serious reprimand. The process of dressing a Victorian lady was a complex engineering project. The maid had to have the physical strength to tighten the corset correctly. At this moment, a forced intimacy arose between the maid and her mistress. She saw her mistress's body, its imperfections and signs of aging, hidden from others. The maid was a true master of hairdressing and sewing. She knew how to create complex hairstyles using hairpieces and hot tongs. Restoring expensive lace and silk required precision and good eyesight. She would sit by the window for hours, saving her mistress's favorite dresses. But her main function was to keep secrets and act as a confidant. She knew the contents of the letters she brought on a tray to the boudoir. She heard complaints about husbands, gossip about friends, and confessions of weaknesses. This knowledge made her position dangerous. She knew too much. One of the main privileges of a chambermaid was the right to wear her mistress's clothes. She got dresses that were out of fashion or that the lady had grown slightly tired of. Thanks to this, she always looked better than the other maids in the house. This caused envy and often made her an outcast among the staff. Her room was usually located next to her mistress's bedroom for quick access. She had to be ready to come when the bell rang at any time of the day or night. She often had to stay awake until dawn, waiting for her mistress to return from the ball. Helping the tired lady undress was her last duty of the day. When traveling, the chambermaid was an indispensable companion and organizer of daily life. She was responsible for packing huge trunks, where each dress was wrapped in tissue paper. She had to create comfort and a familiar atmosphere in any hotel room. For her, traveling was not a vacation, but work in difficult conditions. Loneliness was a frequent companion in this profession, despite the proximity to the mistress. She did not belong to the world of the masters, but she was also distant from the world of ordinary servants. The chambermaid was suspended in social limbo without any real friends. All she could do was live in the reflected light of her lady's life. Her devotion had to be absolute and unquestionable. In return, she received relative comfort, but paid for it with her freedom. She lived someone else's life, often sacrificing the opportunity to create her own. If you like learning such details about people from the past, please like this video. Ready to learn about a woman whose key ring jingled like shackles for negligent maids? The housekeeper was the rightful ruler of the entire household of a huge mansion. Her status was so high that she was addressed as Mrs., regardless of her marital status. It was a tribute to her experience, age, and enormous responsibility. She was in charge of all the material valuables in the house, except for wine and silver. She was responsible for the huge stock of bed linen, tablecloths, and towels. The linen cupboards were her library, where each stack was numbered and accounted for. The loss of a pillowcase was an incident requiring immediate investigation. The housekeeper personally supervised the purchase of provisions and consumables. She kept complex ledgers, recording every pound of sugar and every candle. She had to constantly make sure that merchants did not cheat and servants did not steal. Honesty was her main asset in the eyes of the owners of the house. Her authority extended to all the female staff, from maids to dishwashers. She hired the girls and had the right to dismiss them for the slightest offense. Her gaze noticed dust on the cornice that no one else saw. The morning inspection of the rooms was a real test of nerves for the maids. The housekeeper's particular pride was the still room, a room for preparations and quiet work. Here she made jams, infused liqueurs, and prepared homemade medicines. Knowledge of recipes for cough syrups and ointments was an essential part of her qualifications. The shelves in this room were bursting with jars bearing her neat labels. She also acted as the guardian of morality in the house. The housekeeper strictly ensured that the maids did not flirt with the footmen. Any indiscretions were nipped in the bud to prevent scandal. She was a strict mother to a dozen young girls away from home. In the evenings, when the main work was done, she would retreat to her living room. There she would mend the most expensive and delicate linen or lace. It was a time of relative peace when she could drink a cup of tea. But even then, her ears caught every sound in the house. Her relationship with the butler resembled a diplomatic alliance between two superpowers. They divided their spheres of influence, trying not to interfere in each other's affairs unnecessarily. Sometimes they joined forces to defend the interests of the servants before their masters. But more often than not, they simply maintained a polite neutrality. A good housekeeper knew how to run the house so that it was unnoticeable. She was a strategist and logistician, managing a complex system of supplies and cleaning. Without her firm hand, chaos would have ensued in the mansion within a couple of days. She was the backbone that held the whole household together. But the price of this power was high, complete devotion to a stranger's home. She had no time for her own family or children. Her children were the maids, and her home was the rooms that did not belong to her. In the next chapter, you will learn why the owners chose footmen based on the size of their calves. Footmen were perhaps the most expensive and prestigious accessory of a Victorian home. They were selected not so much for their skills as for their physical appearance. Tall stature was considered the main virtue, and extra inches were paid for. A pair of equally tall footmen in the hallway was a source of pride for the owner. Their uniforms cost a fortune and were the most elegant of all the servants. They wore powdered wigs which required daily care and caused a lot of inconvenience. Silk stockings and short breeches showed off their legs, which had to be perfect. If their calves were thin, the footmen would put special pads under their stockings. Their main task was to create an atmosphere of luxury and service. They had to stand motionless for hours in the hall or at the living room door. This required tremendous physical endurance and the ability to fight boredom. They were forbidden to sit, read, or talk while on duty. However, behind the beautiful facade lay hard and dirty physical work. Footmen were the main driving force in the house, carrying heavy loads between floors. They carried baskets of coal for the numerous fireplaces, trying not to stain their livery. Lifting huge copper jugs of hot water for baths was also their responsibility. Caring for oil lamps was a daily routine that took a lot of time. They had to clean the glass bulbs of soot, trim the wicks, and refill the oil. It was dirty work, and the smell of oil often stuck to their hands. At the same time, by evening, they had to look impeccable. During dinner parties, the footmen became synchronized service dancers. They served dishes from the left and cleared plates from the right, moving silently. Any clinking of cutlery or awkward movement was considered a gross mistake. Penalties for broken dishes were deducted from their already modest salaries. There was also a hierarchy among the footmen. The head footman was in charge of the others. He performed lighter and more honorable tasks, such as delivering letters. The junior footmen did the dirtiest work and were subjected to hazing. Career advancement was slow and depended on when a higher position became available. Footmen often accompanied their mistress on trips to the city or visits. They walked behind her at a respectful distance, carrying her purchases or umbrella. Their presence ensured the lady's safety and emphasized her status. For them, it was a rare opportunity to see the street. A special tax on hair powder was levied on them, which was paid by their employer. This made maintaining a staff of footmen even more expensive and prestigious. The more men in livery there were in the house, the richer the family was considered to be. It was a living indicator of financial well-being. Despite their outward glamour, They were deprived of the basic freedom to choose their appearance. They were forbidden to wear beards, mustaches, or have long hair without a wig. All their individuality was erased by a layer of powder and identical uniforms. They were beautiful dolls in the hands of the aristocracy. Are you ready to learn the harsh truth about why a prestigious job in the kitchen was considered real hard labor, despite constant access to delicious food? This huge room was traditionally called the heart of the home because it was the source of life that nourished the entire family and staff of servants. But for the staff who worked there from dawn to dusk, it often became a stifling torture chamber. At the center of this culinary world stood, like a pagan altar, a huge cast iron stove that ran on coal. This black metal monster burned around the clock, as it took too long to light it to extinguish it at night. It heated the air in the room to unbearable temperatures, turning the kitchen into a sauna even on the coldest winter days. The cooks were forced to work in tropical heat, unable to get any fresh air. The heat from the stove was so intense that it melted candles and damaged the skin on women's faces. The most unfortunate and powerless creature in any Victorian kitchen was the dishwasher, who occupied the lowest rung on the service ladder. Usually, a young teenage girl from a poor family who was willing to do any job for a piece of bread was hired for this position. She was virtually invisible, her only task being to clean up after others. Her hands were constantly red, swollen, and corroded by the caustic alkali contained in detergents. She washed mountains of greasy dishes and heavy pots in ice-cold or, at best, lukewarm water with added soda ash. Hot water was saved for cooking and the needs of the masters, so the dishwasher got the leftovers. The skin on her hands became rough, cracked, and often bled from constant contact with grease and chemicals. But she couldn't stop, as dirty dishes came in a continuous stream during dinner parties. The dishwasher was the first to get up in the house, usually around 5 in the morning, when it was still pitch dark outside. Her first task was to clean the mountains of cold ashes from the furnace and relight the huge stove. It was hard and dirty work, requiring her to carry buckets of coal and breathe coal dust. By the time the head cook arrived, the oven had to be completely ready for use and heated to the right temperature. She was always the last to go to bed, only after the last pot had been washed and put away on the shelves after a late dinner. She had no time for rest, reading, or a personal life, as she was exhausted from fatigue. Her working day could last 16 or even 18 hours without a lunch break, which she ate on the go. It was real slavery disguised as an employment contract. Cleaning vegetables was another endless and monotonous duty of the junior kitchen staff. Every day they had to sort and peel huge sacks of potatoes, carrots, and onions by hand to prepare meals for dozens of people. It was a job that never ended, as vegetables were the staple of the diet. The girls sat for hours on low stools without straightening their backs. Their eyes watered from the pungent onion juice, their backs ached from the uncomfortable posture, and their fingers turned black and rough from the ingrained dirt. There was no question of protective rubber gloves at that time. Everything was done with bare hands. Often, the skin on their fingers was rubbed raw by the rough skin of the root vegetables. But there was no one to complain to because there was a line of people waiting outside the gate to take their place. Shiny copper utensils, the pride and joy of any wealthy kitchen, required daily exhausting polishing. Dozens of pots, jelly molds, and saucepans hung on the walls, demonstrating the wealth of the house. But behind this shine lay titanic labor. They were cleaned with a coarse mixture of fine river sand, vinegar, and salt, rubbing the metal to a mirror shine. This task required great physical strength and perseverance, taking up hours of precious time every day. Every speck of grease or oxidation had to be removed immediately. Dull or darkened copper was considered a sure sign of laziness and sloppiness on the part of the cook, which could disgrace the house in front of guests. The shine of the pots was more important than the health of those who cleaned them. Lighting in the kitchen was often poor and insufficient, as the windows usually faced deep semi-basement pits or an inner courtyard. Daylight struggled to penetrate the bars, leaving the corners of the room in perpetual semi-darkness. It was necessary to work by the artificial light of gas lamps, which hissed and burned the already scarce oxygen. In the evenings, when the main work was over, all the servants gathered here to gossip and relax. They discussed the oddities and whims of their masters, shared news, and laughed as they sat by the cooling stove. It was a kind of private club for the select few, where gentlemen were effectively barred from entering by etiquette. There was an atmosphere of brotherhood here, cemented by common labor. However, this relative satiety and warmth came at the cost of ruined health and prematurely worn-out bodies. Varicose veins from constantly standing on their feet, terrible burns, and chronic fatigue were occupational diseases of cooks. People age quickly in this climate, losing their former strength and beauty. People literally burned out in this grueling work as quickly as the black coal in their insatiable stoves. Rarely could anyone remain in the kitchen until old age while maintaining their health. In the next chapter, we will descend even further into the realm of acrid fumes and dangerous chemicals to learn the secrets of the laundry room. The laundry room of a Victorian mansion was a place where women's strength was put to the ultimate test. Washing in those days was not a matter of pressing a button, but of hard physical labor. The process took several days a week and required the participation of several women. Mountains of laundry were carried to special rooms where constant dampness reigned. The laundry was soaked in huge vats, to which aggressive chemicals were added. Lye, soda, and various bleaches, which were extremely caustic, were used. Women had to work with these solutions with their bare hands. Chemical burns and dermatitis were common among laundresses. The washing itself was done by hand on ribbed boards, which required monotonous effort. Each sheet had to be rubbed until it was spotless. The women's backs ached from constantly being in a bent position. By the end of the day, their hands were swollen and refused to obey. Wringing out wet laundry was a separate test for the muscles, especially large items. Duvet covers and heavy linen tablecloths, soaked with water, weighed dozens of pounds. Later, hand rollers appeared, but their rotation also required strength. Often this work was done in pairs, twisting the fabric into a bundle. Drying laundry in the humid English climate became a logistical problem. If it was raining outside, the laundry was hung up in special drying rooms. Stoves were lit there to create a high temperature for moisture evaporation. The air in such rooms was heavy, like in a Turkish bath. Ironing was the pinnacle of skill, and at the same time, the most dangerous stage. The irons were made entirely of metal, cast iron, and heated on a hot stove. The laundress had to determine the temperature of the iron by touch, holding it to her cheek. A mistake could result in burnt fabric or a ruined item. The irons were heavy, weighing several kilograms each, and had to be constantly replaced. During the day, the laundress lifted and lowered tons of cast iron with one hand. This led to occupational joint deformities and chronic pain. In addition, there was always the risk of dropping a hot iron on her foot. Starching collars and cuffs was a delicate science that did not tolerate carelessness. It was necessary to prepare a solution of the correct consistency so that the fabric would hold its shape. Too much starch made the item wooden and rubbed the owner's neck. Too little, and the collar lost its appearance after an hour of wear. Laundry workers often worked in isolation from the rest of the house, in separate outbuildings. They rarely saw the owners or even other servants, except for those who brought the laundry. It was a closed group of women united by a common hard lot. Their work was hidden, but the result was visible to everyone. Rheumatism and lung disease were the occupational hazards of all laundry workers. Constant changes in heat and cold, dampness, and drafts undermined their immunity. Few laundresses lived to old age in good health. They gave their strength so that others could sleep on clean sheets. The personal lives of servants were regulated by a set of draconian rules, the main one being no followers. This meant a categorical ban on visits from admirers, friends, or suitors. The masters believed that personal attachments distracted the servants from their direct duties. The house was to be the sole center of their universe and interests. Most servants living in the house were required to remain single. Marriage for a footman or maid almost always meant immediate dismissal. They had to choose between personal happiness and a roof over their heads. Many postponed starting a family for many years, until retirement. Free time was given out in small doses, like prescription medicine. Usually it was one evening a week and half of Sunday to attend church. But even during these hours, there was a strict curfew. Being 5 minutes late could result in the doors being locked. Inside the house, relations between men and women were also strictly controlled. Separate bedrooms, separate staircases, and even different sides of the table. Any flirting or long conversation was considered a breach of discipline. The housekeeper and butler monitored morality with the zeal of inquisitors. The pregnancy of an unmarried maid was a disaster on par with the end of the world. Such a girl was thrown out onto the street on the same day, often without being allowed to collect her belongings. Without references or money, she found herself in a desperate situation. Many tragedies of that time were the result of this cruel system. Attending church on Sundays was a mandatory ritual for all staff. It was not only a religious duty, but also a way to control their behavior. In church, servants sat on specially designated benches behind their masters. Even in the presence of God, social distance was strictly maintained. The appearance of servants was regulated down to the smallest detail, depriving them of their individuality. Bright ribbons, jewelry, or non-regulation hairstyles were prohibited. Maids had to wear bonnets, which many hated as a symbol of slavery. Any display of personal taste was punished as rebellion. Vacations were short and rare, usually no more than 2 weeks a year. Traveling home was expensive and ate up a significant portion of their savings. Many servants did not see their aging parents for years. They became strangers in their native villages. The entire system was built on the suppression of personality and its replacement with function. A person became the hands, feet, or voice that the master needed. Emotional needs were ignored as insignificant whims. Service required complete self-denial and sacrifice. The most powerful tool for managing personnel was not shouting, but quiet fear. Every servant's nightmare was to be fired without a letter of recommendation or character reference. At that time, this piece of paper replaced a passport, work record book, and reputation all rolled into one. Without a good character reference, it was impossible to find work in a decent household. The employer could refuse to give a recommendation for any reason, even the most absurd. A bad mood, a sidelong glance, or simply a whim could ruin a life. Servants were completely powerless against the arbitrariness of their employers. This forced people to endure humiliation and remain silent for years. An accusation of theft was a death sentence for any servant's career. Even if the missing item was found, the shadow of suspicion remained forever. Servants lived in constant tension, responsible for valuables they could not afford to buy. A broken vase could cost more than their annual salary. The lack of social security made illness a terrible threat to the future. Sick leave did not exist, and treatment was at one's own expense. If a servant was ill for a long time, they were simply dismissed and replaced by a healthy one. No one wanted to keep a coughing or lame worker in their house. There was no state pension system at that time. Old age frightened everyone who had not managed to save money or start a family. Only a few noble families paid a small allowance to their elderly servants. Most old people faced the fate of becoming a burden on their relatives or ending up in a workhouse. The workhouse was a place used to scare children and disobedient maids. It was a prison-like institution for the poor and homeless. Ending up there meant falling to the bottom of society and losing one's dignity. Fear of the workhouse made people cling to any job they had. Competition in the labor market was fierce due to the influx of people from the villages. Dozens of applicants vied for every position of footman or maid. Employers knew this and could dictate any conditions and wages. If you don't like it, leave. There's a line outside the gate. This argument worked without fail. The sudden death of the head of the family or the financial collapse of the household were common occurrences. In such cases, the entire staff, from the butler to the dishwasher, found themselves out on the street. The The sale of property and the closure of the household were a personal tragedy for dozens of people. Their stability was illusory and depended on someone else's wallet. This fear cemented the system, making rebellion virtually impossible. People were afraid of losing the little they had. Loyalty was often based not on love for their masters, but on fear of hunger. It was a cruel school of survival under the guise of propriety. Uncertainty about tomorrow was a constant backdrop to their lives. They planned, saved, and hoped, but one accident could ruin everything. The life of a servant is like walking a tightrope without a safety net, and waiting for them below was not a soft net, but a stone pavement. By the beginning of the 20th century, the seemingly eternal and unshakable monolithic world of Victorian servants began to show serious cracks. Technological progress, which so frightened many conservatives, began to rapidly change the lives of even the oldest households. The advent of electric lighting freed the staff from the daily drudgery of cleaning and refilling hundreds of oil lamps. Previously, this took hours of dirty work, but now it was enough to flip a switch to fill the house with light. The first, albeit cumbersome, vacuum cleaners and washing machines gradually began to replace the heavy manual labor of laundresses and maids. What used to require the physical effort of a whole team of strong women was now done by machines. This reduced the need for a large staff of servants, making housekeeping more economical. Machines did not require food or housing and did not complain of fatigue. Technology began to free people from domestic slavery. The rapid development of industry opened up completely new and tempting horizons for the working class. Factories, huge plants, and new department stores offered jobs with clear, standardized schedules and guaranteed pay. They paid in cash, not food and lodging, as in the mansions of the gentry. This gave a sense of financial freedom and independence from the whims of the master. Young people no longer wanted to live in other people's homes under the constant and vigilant supervision of a housekeeper or butler. The opportunity to have free evenings for dancing and weekends for their personal lives appealed to them much more than a beautiful livery. Working in a factory allowed them to rent a room and live on their own terms, starting their own families. The old system of total control over the lives of servants began to be perceived as a prison. The First World War was the global historical turning point that finally and irrevocably destroyed the old order. Male servants, from footmen to grooms, went to the front en masse, and many of them died in the trenches. Those who returned brought with them a new understanding of life, in which there was no place for humiliation before the aristocracy. The brotherhood of the trenches erased class boundaries, showing that a bullet does not choose between a lord and a servant. Relations between social classes began to change rapidly towards democratization and simplification. The sacred distance and reverence for the lords on which the system was based disappeared forever. People no longer saw aristocrats as superior beings worthy of worship. Respect now had to be earned through personal qualities, not titles. Servants gradually began to realize their civil rights, join labor unions, and demand respect for their work. They were no longer afraid of dismissal, as the labor market offered many alternatives. The era of silent obedience and willingness to serve for food was gone forever. The era of employment contracts and regulated breaks began. Strict butlers and personal valets, symbols of the old era, were becoming a dying breed. Their skills in managing large staffs were no longer in demand in the new, more compact households. Young, wealthy people preferred to drive themselves rather than keep a chauffeur and a groom. The world was becoming too fast-paced for old ceremonies. New homes now made do with a cleaning lady and a single cook who lived in their own homes. Life became simpler, faster, and much less formal, without endless changes of clothes for dinner. The complex and cumbersome rituals of Victorian life now seemed absurd and ridiculous relics of the past. Privacy became more valued than having an entourage behind you. However, the high culture of service established in those days did not disappear without a trace. High standards of service, impeccable etiquette, and obsessive attention to detail became the legacy of the era, passing into the hotel and restaurant business. The best traditions of hospitality, born in English estates, became the global benchmark for quality. We still use the rules of service invented by butlers. We still admire the aesthetics of movies and TV series with bated breath, often forgetting the price that was paid. Behind every perfectly polished silver cutlery set was someone's difficult fate and hands rubbed raw. The beauty of Victorian life was built on the bones of invisible laborers. It is important to remember this when admiring crystal chandeliers. The real stories of these people are no longer a closely guarded secret and have finally come out of the shadows. The diaries and memoirs of former servants that have been found have become important historical documents that reveal the truth. They tell us what happened behind the green doors of the servants' quarters, without embellishment or romanticism. Historians began to study the lives of the lower classes with the same interest as the lives of kings. The world of Victorian servants was cruel and unjust, but in its own way orderly and even majestic. It taught us to value human dignity and the inalienable right of everyone to a private life. This era showed what social inequality, elevated to an absolute, leads to. It is an important reminder of how far we have come in protecting labor rights and freedoms. But it is also a serious reason to think about those people who quietly serve us today in cafes and hotels. Has our attitude towards service personnel really changed? We have walked a long way through the corridors and staircases of a Victorian house. We peered behind a green door and saw a world hidden from the eyes of history. It was a universe of hard work, strict rules, and human resilience. We learned that the glamour of the era rested on the shoulders of thousands of invisible people. Their fates were intertwined with those of their masters, but they always remained in the shadows. They sacrificed their freedom to create the illusion of an ideal life for others. Today, their stories evoke a mixture of horror and deep respect. It was a unique social experiment that will never be repeated. Do you think you could survive in such a harsh hierarchy and discipline? Or would modern values of freedom make it impossible for you? Write your opinion in the comments, because history only comes alive in discussion, and subscribe to the channel to learn even more secrets of the past.